I was never one to believe in strange stories. Growing up in a small town, you hear plenty of them. Things people swear happened, stories passed down to scare kids from wandering too far. I always brushed them off. But there are some things you can't explain, things that shake you so deeply they stay with you for the rest of your life. I found that out one winter when I spent a week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin. My uncle was the kind of man who preferred the company of trees over people. His cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't fancy, just a small one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a single window overlooking the trees. He built it himself back when he still hunted. The last time I saw him, he told me he hadn't been out there in years, said he was getting too old to make the hike. I asked if I could borrow the place for a few days, get away from everything. He handed me the keys without a second thought. The drive out was uneventful. I left my truck parked at the bottom of a long dirt trail leading into the woods, packed up my supplies, and hiked the 2 miles up to the cabin. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of snow that muffled every sound. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the only person left in the world. The first day was fine. I gathered firewood, checked the place over, and settled in for the night. The wind picked up after dark, howling through the trees, rattling the window pane. I'd always liked storms, found them comforting, but there was something different about being alone in the woods. Every sound felt sharper, every creak of the old cabin louder than it should have been. I didn't sleep well. Something about the stillness outside made me uneasy, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. City life had made me too used to background noise. Out here, silence was normal. That's what I told myself. The second night was worse. I woke up to a sound I couldn't explain. Not the wind, not the groaning of trees shifting under their own weight. It was closer, a low, rhythmic crunching in the snow, slow and deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned low, the glow barely reaching the window. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Then silence. Nothing but the wind outside. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. A full minute passed. 2. Then I heard it. A long, slow scrape against the wooden wall, something dragging against it. Claws. My stomach tightened. I grabbed the rifle my uncle kept in the cabin, loaded but never fired. I sat up, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. Another scrape, this time against the door. I kept waiting for the knock, for whoever or whatever it was to try the handle. But it never did. Instead, the breathing started. Heavy, labored, like something trying to suck in air through a throat that was too tight. It was just outside the door, right there. I raised the rifle, pointed it at the door, even though I couldn't see anything. I wanted to shout, scare it off, but the words caught in my throat. My body refused to move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence again. No footsteps leaving, no sounds of movement, just the wind. I sat there for hours, rifle in my lap, eyes never leaving the door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I forced myself to step outside. The snow was untouched. No tracks, no signs that anything had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just spooked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't leave tracks. That night, I barricaded the door, wedging a chair under the handle, stacking firewood against it. It wouldn't stop anything determined to get in, but it made me feel better. Came back. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The scraping against the walls, the heavy breathing outside the door. But this time there was something new. A sound I can't describe properly. A low, guttural growl, stretched into something almost human. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a person. It was something else. And then I heard it try the door. The handle rattled, testing. Then it stopped. I gripped the rifle so tight my hands ached. The next sound made my stomach drop. It started at the window, a long, slow exhale against the glass. I didn't move, didn't even blink. And then a shape, a shadow, massive, blocking out the faint moonlight. Too tall for a person, too broad. A head, pointed ears, a shape that reminded me of a dog, if dogs stood on two legs. It stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, it lowered itself as if trying to see inside. I don't remember much after that. My body moved before my mind did. I fired the rifle. The blast was deafening in the small cabin. The shadow jerked back. I fired again. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gun in my hands, eyes locked on the door until the sun came up. When I finally found the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. No blood, no tracks, nothing. Just silence, the same as before. I left everything behind. My pack, my supplies. I walked out, rifle still clutched in my hands, back down the trail to my truck. I didn't look back. I never told my uncle what happened. Never told anyone. But I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. No internet, no phone calls, just peace. I needed the break. Life had been wearing me down, and a friend of a friend had a cabin they rarely used. They said I could stay there for free as long as I locked up when I left. It was an old place, built sometime in the 50s with no running water but a wood stove for heat. I didn't mind roughing it. The isolation was the whole point. I drove out there in the early afternoon, taking winding back roads that turned to dirt the further I went. The trees were thick, mostly pine, and stretched endlessly in every direction. No houses, no signs of people. It was perfect. The last few miles were the roughest, my truck bouncing over ruts and potholes. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows over the clearing. It was smaller than I expected, just a single room with a loft for sleeping. The wood was weathered, and the windows were old and single-paned, but it looked sturdy. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. I stretched my legs, walking the perimeter, making sure everything looked sound. The trees started barely 10 feet from the cabin's edge, thick and dark. There was an outhouse a short walk away, and beyond that, the woods sloped down into a valley. I could hear a creek running somewhere below. The quiet was deep, only broken by birds and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth. I felt good. I unloaded my supplies, stacking firewood by the door and setting up inside. There was an old cast iron stove, a table, a single chair, and a cot in the corner. The loft had a thin mattress, dusty but usable. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat outside as the last of the daylight faded. The sky turned deep blue, then black. Stars filled the sky, brighter than I had ever seen them. It was the kind of night that made you feel small. I went inside when the cold set in, shut the door, and locked it. The stove crackled, casting flickering light across the room. I settled into the cot with my book, listening to the wind outside. It was peaceful. I fell asleep without realizing it. I woke up to a sound, something moving outside. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening. It was slow, deliberate, just beyond the wall. A soft crunch of leaves, the scrape of something against the wood. My first thought was a deer, maybe a bear. I sat up carefully, reaching for the flashlight. The noise stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just the wind again. I told myself it was nothing and tried to sleep, but every little creak of the cabin made me tense. Eventually, exhaustion won. Morning came cold and gray. I stepped outside, half expecting to find tracks, but the ground was undisturbed. Probably just my imagination. The day passed in quiet routine. I hiked a little, collected firewood, and read. The solitude felt good. That night, I was more tired. Sleep came easier. But then the sound returned. Closer. I jolted awake, heart pounding. The sound of something moving, slow and heavy, breathing, right outside the window. I didn't move. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers. In the dim light, I could just make out the window. And then a shape moved past it. Large, four-legged. The way it moved made my skin crawl. Too smooth, too deliberate. I stayed still, barely breathing. It circled the cabin. Slow. Then the sound of sniffing, deep and wet, at the base of the door. Every instinct told me not to move. My gun was on the table just a few feet away, but I couldn't risk it. The sniffing stopped. Silence. Then a soft scratch at the wood. Not like a dog's. Longer. A scrape, almost careful. My mouth was dry. I sat there for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning felt unreal. Sunlight streamed through the windows like nothing had happened. I stepped outside, searching the ground. There were prints. Large, dog-like, but wrong. Too elongated. Too deep. My stomach turned. I told myself it was a big stray, maybe a coyote. But the way it had moved, the way it had circled, felt off. I thought about leaving, but part of me refused to be scared away by some animal. I convinced myself it was nothing. I carried on with my day. That night, I reinforced the door with a heavy chair, stoked the fire higher, and kept my gun within reach. I lay awake, waiting. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, it returned. I heard it moving before I saw it. A shadow through the window, blocking the faint moonlight. Then the door creaked. It was testing it, pushing. My grip tightened on the gun. A low, guttural breath, almost a growl. The hair on my arms stood up. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating. Then scratching. Slow, deliberate. Not frantic like a normal animal. It knew I was inside. It was waiting. The fire popped, the only other sound. I don't know how long it stayed. Maybe an hour. Maybe more. Eventually, it left just like before. The woods swallowed the sound. But the unease didn't fade. It was playing with me. The next day, I packed. I had planned to stay the week, but something deep in my gut told me I wouldn't last another night. I loaded the truck quickly, avoiding looking at the trees. The forest felt different now. Watching. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, just for a second, and I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. Large, dark, too tall for a dog. Watching me leave. Not chasing, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I made it back to town by evening, shaking but safe. I never told my friend why I left early. I never went back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't meant to be seen. And it had let me go. This time. I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. It was something I had been meaning to do for a while. A break from the noise, the constant movement, the feeling of always being around people. I wanted silence, fresh air, and a chance to just exist without thinking about work or anything else. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch of road was rough, just dirt and gravel with deep ruts that made my tires slip a little. The trees grew so thick on either side that they blocked out most of the late afternoon sun. My GPS stopped working about 30 minutes before I reached the cabin, but I had written down the directions. It wasn't hard to find, just an old wooden structure, sitting in a clearing, with a wraparound porch and a single rocking chair swaying slightly in the breeze. The air smelled clean, like pine and damp earth. There was a small fire pit out front, surrounded by a few logs for sitting. The nearest neighbor was at least 15 miles away. Perfect. I got out of the car and stretched my legs, feeling stiff from the long drive. The woods were quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of birds settling in for the night. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a kitchen along the back wall, a small bathroom, and a bedroom with a single window that faced the woods. Everything was old but clean. The floors creaked under my weight as I walked around, setting my bag down near the couch. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the pit outside, cooked some food, and sat watching the flames until they died down to embers. The air grew colder, and the only sounds were crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. When I finally went inside, I locked the door, checked the windows, and crawled into bed. The mattress was stiff, but I was tired. I fell asleep quickly. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me exactly, more like a feeling, a sense that something was different. The room was pitch black. I reached out and grabbed my phone, but the screen was dead. I had charged it before bed, so that didn't make sense. I listened for a few minutes, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the wind against the cabin, the usual sounds of the forest. Eventually, I fell asleep again. In the morning, my phone turned on without an issue, still showing a full charge. I shook it off as a glitch and went about my day, hiking through the woods, enjoying the solitude. I found an old hunting trail that led to a stream, sat by the water for a while, then made my way back before it got dark. That night, I built another fire, ate dinner, and watched the stars. The sky out here was massive, free of light pollution, the stars brighter than I had ever seen them. It was beautiful, but the quiet started to feel heavy, like something pressing in around me. I ignored the feeling and went inside. I locked the door again, checked the windows, then crawled into bed. I left my phone on the nightstand, screen facing up, just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, there was a noise, faint but steady, a soft tapping sound. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. It was coming from the front porch. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, breathing as quietly as I could. The tapping continued for a minute, then stopped. Silence stretched out around me, thick and heavy. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Something was moving on the porch. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My phone was still on the nightstand, but I didn't want to turn on the flashlight. Instead, I reached under the bed where I had left my bag and grabbed the hunting knife I always carried when camping. Another creak, then another. The porch wasn't big. If someone was out there, they were close to the door. I forced myself to move, standing up slowly, keeping my breathing steady. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. The rocking chair was still, the fire pit cold and dark. But something felt wrong. The woods looked different, the trees like they had shifted somehow, standing closer than before. I stood there for a long time, knife clenched in my fist, waiting. But nothing happened. No more sounds. No movement. Eventually, I climbed back into bed, still gripping the knife, and stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. The next morning, I walked out onto the porch. The wood felt solid beneath my feet. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But when I turned to go back inside, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The door frame had scratches on it. Long, deep scratches running down the wood. I packed up my things. I didn't want to stay another night. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The rocking chair swayed slightly in the breeze. The door frame still bore the marks of whatever had been out there. I didn't know what had scratched the wood. I didn't want to know. I drove away, my tires kicking up dust, not stopping until I reached the main road. My phone had full service again. The world felt normal, safe. But I never went back to that cabin. And I never rented another one like it again. I had been out hunting for most of the day, pushing deeper into the woods than I normally did. The air was crisp, and the ground was damp from the rain the night before, making the forest quiet except for the occasional bird call or rustle in the undergrowth. I hadn't had much luck, just a single rabbit slung over my shoulder, but I figured it was enough for a decent meal. My cabin wasn't far now, maybe another 20 minutes of walking, and I was already picturing the warmth of the fire, the smell of cooking meat, and the feeling of finally resting my legs. The first thing I noticed when I got close was the door. It was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. I always did. Living this far out, you had to be careful about bears and even people sometimes. My stomach tightened, and I slowed my steps. The trees around my cabin felt too still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stopped a few yards away, listening. Nothing. No movement inside. No sound of anything shifting or breathing. Just the wind moving through the trees. I tightened my grip on my rifle and took a slow step forward. My heart was pounding now, my brain running through possibilities. A bear? Maybe, but the door wasn't smashed open. That thought made me even more uneasy. I nudged the door open with the barrel of my rifle. The dim interior of the cabin came into view, the last bits of daylight slipping through the windows. Something felt off immediately. The air smelled wrong. A mix of damp wood, sweat, and something else. Something sour and unfamiliar. My eyes swept the room. My chair was knocked over, and the table had been shoved slightly out of place. Small things, barely noticeable, but enough to tell me someone or something had been inside. I stepped inside carefully, my boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The rifle was raised now, finger resting just outside the trigger guard. My bedding was rumpled, as if someone had been lying in it. A few of my supplies were missing from the shelves, cans knocked over, one of them even punctured, the contents smeared across the floor. I glanced toward the back corner where my hunting gear was stored. My knife was missing. Then I saw the footprints. Dark smudges on the wooden floor, not quite human, not quite animal. Barefoot but wrong. The toes were too long, too thin, almost claw-like at the ends. They led toward the corner near the fireplace, then vanished. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My own breathing sounded too loud in the silence. I followed the prints with my eyes, tracking them toward the shadows near the fireplace. My hand tightened around the rifle. There was something there, a shape, crouched low, half hidden by the darkness. My pulse hammered in my ears. At first, it looked like just another shadow, a trick of the dim light. But then it moved. My whole body went rigid. The thing was hunched over, its limbs long and thin, its skin a mottled, patchy gray. It had no clothes, no fur, just bare, stretched skin over sinewy muscle. Its head turned slowly, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Too flat, too wide, with dark, sunken eyes that reflected the firelight like wet stones. Its mouth was slightly open, showing teeth. Jagged, uneven, too many of them. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My hands were slick with sweat against the rifle stock, but I held my ground. Then it shifted, not toward me, but sideways, its long fingers pressing against the wooden floor for balance. It was watching me, gauging me. I had the gun, but I didn't know if a single shot would stop something like this. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I knew better. Running triggered pursuit. Predators chased things that ran. I took a slow step back, keeping my eyes on it. Twitched, tilting its head slightly, but didn't lunge. Another step back. My boot touched the edge of the doorframe. Almost there, almost outside. Then, without warning, it moved. Not toward me, but away. In one fluid motion, it scrambled up the stone of the fireplace, its fingers finding impossible holds in the rough surface. It climbed with a horrible, unnatural speed, folding itself into the chimney opening. And then it was gone. I stood there, rifle still raised, breath coming in short gasps. The only sound was the wind outside, whispering through the trees. My whole body was trembling. My mind struggled to make sense of what I had just seen. I forced myself to move, stepping outside and slamming the door shut behind me. My breath clouded in the cold air. The world felt normal out here, quiet, steady, real. Inside that cabin, something had changed. Something had been in there, and now I had no idea where it had gone. I didn't sleep that night. I built a fire outside, sat with my back against a tree, and kept the rifle across my lap. Every creak of the branches, every rustle of the leaves sent my nerves on edge. By morning, the first thing I did was check the chimney. Nothing. No signs of anything climbing out, no tracks leading away from the cabin. But the smell lingered, that sour, musky scent, like something had been living inside for far too long. I spent the next few days outside as much as possible, only going in for supplies. I kept the fire high at night, kept my gun close, kept listening. But whatever it was, it didn't come back. Or if it did, it made sure I never saw it again. After a week, I couldn't take it anymore. The cabin wasn't home anymore. I packed what I could carry and left, heading for town, leaving the rest behind. I never told anyone the real reason I left. Just said the place didn't feel right anymore. I don't know if that thing was something natural, some animal I just didn't recognize, or something else entirely. I only know that I never went back, and I never spent another night alone in the woods again. The cabin sat alone in the woods, far from the nearest paved road. It had been a rental for years, passed between owners, always used for short stays, never lived in for long. I had taken it for a week, needing time away from everything, a break from city noise and endless distractions. The first few days had been exactly what I wanted. Cold mornings with hot coffee, afternoons spent hiking through the trees, and long evenings by the fire, listening to the wind through the pines. It was the fourth night when things changed. I had left the windows open just slightly to let the cool air in. The cabin's interior still smelled like fresh-cut wood, the scent stronger when the air shifted. I had spent the day hiking a narrow trail that led deep into the forest, and my legs ached. I was reading when I first noticed it, the sound of movement outside. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a small animal. The footsteps were heavy, slow, deliberate. I sat up, holding my breath. The fire had burned low, filling the room with flickering orange light. The footsteps stopped, and for a while I thought maybe I had imagined them. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood, moving quietly to the window, careful not to step too hard on the old wooden floor. Outside, past the tree line, something moved. First, I thought it was a dog. His body was low, its head turning slightly as if sniffing the air. But something was wrong. It was too big, its movements unnatural. The way it held itself, too rigid, too stiff, it felt wrong. Then, as I watched, it did something that sent a chill through my body. It stood up, not like a bear, not like anything I had ever seen before. His back straightened in one unnatural motion, legs locking into place. It wasn't adjusting, wasn't shifting its weight like an animal would. It just stood, its head turned toward the cabin, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had seen me. I ducked down, my heart pounding. I stayed there for minutes, listening, waiting. The fire cracked behind me, and my breathing felt too loud in the silence. I needed to see if it was still there. Slowly, I lifted my head just enough to see outside. It was closer now, much closer. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the porch light's reach. The thing wasn't just standing, it was smiling. Its mouth was stretched too wide, its teeth too visible in the dim light. Its head tilted slightly, like it was listening, waiting. I backed away from the window. My first thought was to lock the doors, check the windows, make sure every possible entrance was shut. My hands shook as I moved through the cabin, sliding locks into place, pulling curtains closed. Every shadow felt like it was moving. Every creak in the wood made me flinch. I didn't sleep that night. Morning came slow, and with it, the feeling of being watched never left. I went outside once the sun was fully up, looking for tracks, some proof that I hadn't imagined it. The ground was damp from the night's dew, but there, just past the porch, were footprints. Not paw prints, footprints. They were deep, like whatever had made them was heavy, but they weren't shaped like a human's. The toes were too long, the arch too sharp. They led from the trees to the porch and then back into the woods. I wanted to leave. My bag was already packed. I had planned to hike a different trail today, but now, I just wanted to go. The problem was, my truck was parked down a long dirt path, about half a mile from the cabin. I had walked in when I arrived, not wanting to risk getting stuck in the mud. If I wanted to leave, I had to walk through those woods. I stayed until midday, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was some animal I had never seen before. Maybe I had just imagined the smile, the way it moved, but deep down I knew I hadn't. When I finally left the cabin, I moved fast, my bag strapped tight to my back. The forest felt different, the air too still, too quiet. The path was narrow, winding through thick trees, and every few steps, I checked over my shoulder. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. They weren't behind me, they were ahead. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The trees blocked most of the light, making it hard to see, but there, just up the path, something moved. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was the same thing. It stood just at the edge of my vision, waiting. I took a step back, took a step forward. I ran. Branches scratched at my arms as I pushed through the undergrowth, my feet slipping on loose dirt. I didn't look back, I didn't stop. The trees blurred past me, and the only sound was my own breathing, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I saw the truck. I fumbled for the keys, nearly dropping them as I reached the driver's side door. The forest felt like it was closing in around me. I threw myself inside, locking the doors, shoving the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear, speeding down the path, kicking up mud and gravel behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see it standing there, watching. I never went back. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online, looking for any stories about that area, anything that could explain what I saw. What I found made my blood run cold. There were other stories, people who had rented that cabin, people who had seen something in the woods, something standing just beyond the tree line. Some had left in the middle of the night. Some had stayed and never spoken about it again. No one had ever stayed for long. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about it. The way it moved, the way it smiled. And I wonder if it ever left those woods, or if it followed me home. I got the cabin from an older guy named Dale who had bought it years ago but barely used it. He said it was a great hunting spot, but he was getting too old to make the trip. It sat deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and uneven ground. The place wasn't big, just a single-room structure with a small stove, a cot, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a shed out back filled with rusted tools and an old axe stuck in a stump. The roof sagged in one corner, but the cabin was sturdy enough. I had planned to spend a week there, just to get away from everything. No cell service, no people, just quiet. I brought enough supplies to last, plus my rifle in case I wanted to try hunting. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent the daylight hours hiking around the area, getting familiar with the land. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a lantern and listen to the sounds of the forest. The only thing that ever broke the silence was the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of branches from some passing animal. On the 3rd night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal noise, more like the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I sat up and listened, heart pounding, but it stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a deer moving through, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. They circled the cabin once before disappearing into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My first thought was that someone had wandered onto my land by accident. Maybe a hunter got lost. But the more I looked at them, the less sense they made. Whoever it was had been barefoot. The prints were deep, meaning they were heavy. They also stopped just past the treeline. No trail leading away, no sign of direction. Just ended, like whoever made them had been lifted off the ground. I kept my rifle close that day, barely straying far from the cabin. As night fell, I double-checked the lock on the door and made sure the shutters were secure. The lantern burned low as I sat at the table, staring at the door. Every creak in the wood made me jump. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, stopping and starting, like someone was pausing to listen. I gripped the rifle and stayed silent. The footsteps circled the cabin, then stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then nothing. Minutes passed, but I didn't move. Eventually, I heard slow footsteps moving away into the trees. Morning came and I found another set of footprints. The same ones as before, but this time they led from the woods to the door and then back into the trees. I was done. I packed my gear in record time and started the hike back to my truck. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear something behind me. I reached my truck and peeled out of there, not stopping until I was back on the main road. A week later, Dale called me. He sounded amused. "Didn't last long up there, huh?" he said. I didn't tell him what happened, just muttered something about being too busy and left it at that. He laughed and told me he'd never spent more than 2 nights in that cabin himself. "Too damn quiet," he said. "Does weird things to a man. I haven't been back since. I don't plan on going back. I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. The footprints were real. The footsteps were real. And whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there." The plan was simple. I just wanted a few days away from everything. No phone, no emails, no people. I found an old cabin online, listed as rustic but livable, sitting deep in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was cheap, isolated, and exactly what I needed. The drive out was long. The last stretch nothing more than a dirt road winding through dense forest. It was early fall, the trees thick with leaves just beginning to turn. A deep orange glow hanging over the landscape. The air smelled clean, fresh, like wet earth and pine. I followed the directions the owner had emailed me, my tires crunching over the uneven road, past an old wooden sign with no writing, just a rusted metal plate hanging loosely from a nail. The cabin itself was small, a single-story structure with a slanted tin roof, weathered wood, and a porch that sagged in the middle. There was a pile of firewood stacked against one wall, some of it fresh, some of it rotting. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a heavy stone near the door. The inside was as basic as expected. A single room with a wood stove, a narrow cot, and a small table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to a tiny bathroom, the toilet hooked up to an old septic system, the sink connected to a well pump outside. No electricity, no running water beyond the hand pump near the back steps. Felt just right. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it getting settled, stacking firewood near the stove, checking the locks on the doors and windows, walking the perimeter of the property. The trees surrounded the cabin in every direction, the dense undergrowth making it impossible to see more than 20 feet in some spots. There was no sign of any trails, no broken branches or footprints that suggested anyone had been through recently. The only noises came from the wind and the occasional bird. That night, I lit a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal from the supplies I'd brought, and sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, isolated, exactly what I'd hoped for. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had died down to glowing embers, the room dimly lit by the red light. The air was cool, the sound of the wind still moving through the trees. Then I heard it, a dull thud, not a branch falling, not an animal moving through the underbrush, something heavier. I sat up, listening. The sound came again, a deep, hollow impact like someone knocking on wood. Not at the door, somewhere outside. I climbed out of bed slowly, moving toward the window, careful not to make any noise. The glass was old, dirty, but I could see enough. The trees stood still in the moonlight, the forest floor shifting with shadows. There was nothing there. Then, just as I was about to turn away, something moved, a shape just at the edge of the trees, low to the ground. I strained my eyes, trying to make out details, but it was too dark, too far. I waited. The shape didn't move. I stepped back from the window, my pulse heavy in my ears. The wind picked up again, the branches creaking, shifting. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, a boar, something normal. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I went outside, walking the area where I thought I'd seen the shape. The ground was covered in leaves, thick and undisturbed, no clear tracks. I told myself I imagined it, that my eyes had played tricks in the dark. The rest of the day was normal. I went for a hike, gathered more firewood, boiled water from the well. By the time the sun started to set, I had almost convinced myself there was nothing to worry about. Then, just after dusk, I found something, a mark on one of the trees near the cabin. Not natural, not from an animal. It was a symbol carved into the bark. Rough, uneven, deep, I ran my fingers over it, feeling the jagged edges, the splintered wood. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Someone had been here. That night, I locked the door, secured the windows, kept the fire going. I barely slept. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The same dull, heavy thud. Closer this time. Then another sound. A scraping noise. Long, slow. Right against the cabin wall. I sat up, heart pounding. I listened. The scraping came again, moving along the wood, pausing, then continuing. I grabbed the hatchet I kept near the stove, my hands sweating against the handle. My breath came slow, shallow. The sound stopped. Silence. Then a single knock at the door. Not hard, not loud, just one deliberate tap. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever was out there, they weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. The fire slowly dying, the darkness stretching around me. Eventually, the sun started to rise. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. Just footprints in the dirt. Bare. Human. Leading away from the cabin into the trees. I packed my things in under 10 minutes. I didn't look back as I drove away. When I got back to town, I called the owner, told him what happened. He listened, quiet, then sighed. "You're not the first," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I just hung up and never went back. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. A break from the city, from the noise, from the constant pressure of life. My uncle owned an old hunting cabin deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. He hadn't used it in years, but it was still in good shape. I'd been there a couple of times before, always with other people, but this time I wanted to be alone. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The drive out was long but peaceful. The last stretch was on an old dirt road that wound through thick forest, the kind of place where cell service was non-existent and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was perfect. When I pulled up to the cabin, the afternoon sun was starting to sink, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked just as I remembered it. A simple wooden structure, small but sturdy, with a front porch and a chimney that hadn't been used in years. I parked the car and got out, stretching my legs. The air smelled different out here, clean, fresh, untouched. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird. I grabbed my bag from the back seat, slung it over my shoulder, and made my way up the steps. The key was right where my uncle said it would be, tucked under a loose board on the porch. Inside, the cabin was exactly as I remembered. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. There were a few shelves with old canned goods and supplies, a hunting rifle mounted above the door, and a stack of firewood beside the stove. I dropped my bag on the cot and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, read by lantern light for a while, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees. But at some point in the night, I woke up. It was completely silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the unnatural kind, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I listened for a while, but all I could hear was my own breathing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore. I had been on the trails near the cabin before, but I wanted to go farther this time. I packed a small bag with some water and a snack, grabbed my uncle's old hunting knife just in case, and set off into the woods. The forest was dense but beautiful. The farther I went, the less it felt like I was in the modern world. No roads, no power lines, just trees, rocks, and the occasional stream. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude, but as the afternoon wore on, I realized I should start heading back. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a feeling, like I wasn't alone. I stopped and listened, but all I could hear was the wind. I shook it off and kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, not obvious, but there. Faint, measured just beyond the trees. I stopped again, heart pounding. The sound stopped too. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods, but I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was my imagination and kept walking. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I picked up my pace. I wasn't running, not yet, but I was moving faster than before. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, but I still didn't see anything. The footsteps kept coming. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. I practically ran up the steps, threw the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. I locked it and stood there, listening. Nothing. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It clung to me like a weight on my chest. I forced myself to make dinner, but I had no appetite. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the creaking of the cabin, even my own breathing felt too loud. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Then I woke up. It was still dark. The cabin was silent, but something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The door, it was open. Not wide open, just a few inches, but enough. Enough for someone or something to be inside. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reached for the knife I had left on the table. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of the cot and stood up. I scanned the room. Nothing looked disturbed. The firewood was still stacked, the shelves untouched. But the door was open. I stepped toward it, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. I reached out, grabbed the door, and slammed it shut, throwing the lock. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not inside. Outside. Right outside. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Who the hell was out there? A lost hiker? A hunter? Someone who had been following me all day? Then the footsteps stopped. Right outside the window. I didn't look. I didn't want to. I knew if I did, I might see something I couldn't handle. Instead, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the door. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the sounds faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and left. I didn't even eat breakfast. I got in my car, started it, and drove. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, silent, unchanged. But as I turned onto the main road, I saw something in the trees. A shape, person, standing just at the edge of the forest, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove. I never went back to that cabin. I told my uncle something felt off about the place, and he just laughed. But I know what I felt, what I heard, what I saw, and I never want to see it again. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend alone at the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old hunting cabin my uncle had built years ago, deep in the woods. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and a lantern for light. That was exactly what I needed. Life had been stressful, and the idea of spending a few days off the grid, away from everything, seemed perfect. The drive out there took nearly 3 hours. The last hour was on a dirt road full of ruts and potholes, bouncing my truck so much I had to keep a death grip on the wheel. I passed no other cars, no signs of people, just dense trees lining both sides of the road. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked beside it, shut off the truck, and sat there for a moment. The forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no birds, just complete stillness. I stepped out, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the short steps to the door. The wooden planks creaked under my weight, something I had always noticed but never paid much attention to. Inside, everything was just as I had left it months ago. A thin layer of dust covered the small wooden table, and the air was stale. I set my bag down and got to work opening the windows, letting the fresh forest air drift inside. I fetched water from the hand pump, filled a few bottles, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot in the corner. The rest of the day was uneventful. I walked to the small creek about half a mile behind the cabin, checked for any sign of animals, and gathered some firewood for the night. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I started a small fire in the fire pit outside. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and listened to the sounds of the forest coming to life. Frogs croaked from the direction of the creek, and the occasional rustling in the brush hinted at small animals moving through. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. When the fire burned low, I doused it, locked the door behind me, and crawled into my sleeping bag. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was pitch black, and the woods outside were silent again. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me from my sleep. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate step on the porch. The creaking of old wood under something heavy. I held my breath, my body completely still. Another step, then another. Something was out there. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot, but didn't turn it on yet. My mind raced. Could have been a bear, maybe a coyote, but something about the way it moved felt different. More intentional. I stayed silent, waiting. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden boards. My stomach tightened. Then a long pause. Silence stretched on so long I started to wonder if I had imagined it. But then knock. Just one. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my ears. No one should be out here. I was miles from the nearest house, and I hadn't seen another vehicle the entire drive up. Who the hell would be knocking at my door in the middle of the night? Another knock, a little harder this time. I swallowed, my mouth dry. I debated grabbing the old rifle my uncle had left behind, but it was unloaded, practically a relic. I decided against making any noise. Instead, I just sat there, gripping the flashlight, listening. The knocking stopped. A long silence followed. Then, just as I was beginning to think whoever or whatever it was had left, I heard something worse. The doorknob rattled. A slow, testing jiggle, like someone seeing if it was locked. I clenched my jaw, my fingers gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The knob twisted again, this time harder. The door creaked but held firm. Then, nothing. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. My muscles burned from staying frozen in place, waiting, listening. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard retreating footsteps. Slow, heavy steps moving away from the porch. The boards creaked one last time, and then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely blinking, every tiny sound sending a fresh wave of panic through me. I didn't dare open the door until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I slowly unbolted the door and pushed it open. The porch was empty, no signs of anything. But then I looked down. Footprints. Large, human-shaped footprints in the dirt, leading up to the door. I scanned the tree line, my skin crawling. Whoever had been here had left, or they were still watching. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and locked up the cabin in record time. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me go. I never went back to that cabin. I left it to rot, untouched, hoping whoever had come knocking that night never found a reason to come back. But sometimes, even now, I still wonder, if I hadn't locked the door, if I had opened it instead, what would I have seen standing there in the dark? I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, with nothing but nature and silence. Life had been stressful lately, and I needed the break. No work, no city noise, no people. Just me, a few books, and a stocked fridge. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, a guy who barely used it anymore. It was small but well-built, with a wood-burning stove, a small bedroom, and a porch that overlooked a dense forest stretching out in every direction. Getting there wasn't easy. The dirt road leading to the place was barely maintained, full of potholes and overgrown branches scraping against my truck. The last few miles were the worst. The road narrowed into little more than a trail, and I had to drive slowly to avoid hitting rocks or sinking into the mud. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, filtering through the trees in long golden streaks. I turned off the engine, stepping out into the cool evening air. It was silent except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves. Perfect. I spent the first night settling in, unpacking my food and gear, checking the water pump, and lighting a fire in the stove. The place smelled like old wood and dust but felt cozy enough. There was no cell service, which was part of the appeal. I read by lantern light for a while before crawling into the bed, listening to the wind moving through the trees. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I took a walk around the property, following an old trail that led down to a small creek about a half-mile away. The water was cold and clear, and I spent some time just sitting on a rock, soaking in the quiet. On my way back, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud, heading in the direction of the cabin. They weren't mine. They were too big, too deep, like someone heavy had walked through recently. I stopped and looked around, but there was no one in sight. The woods were still, just trees and underbrush. No movement, no sound. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old set of tracks from a hunter or some camper who had passed through before the last rain. I went back to the cabin and tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't planned to. It felt unnecessary way out here. But something about those footprints sat wrong with me. I double-checked the latch before getting into bed. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was warm. I closed my eyes, listening to the crackling embers. A sound woke me up. It was soft but distinct, coming from outside. Something moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer passing through. But then it came again, slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden porch. My chest tightened. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. A long pause. Then the doorknob rattled. I felt ice spread through my body. Someone was out there. Someone trying to get in. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbing the heavy flashlight from my pack. My heart was hammering, my hands shaking. I stood by the door, listening. The knob rattled again, harder this time, followed by a low, muffled breath on the other side of the wood. I flicked on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the porch. Empty. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. The forest was silent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were footprints, large, heavy, circling the cabin. The dirt was scuffed near the door where someone had stood, trying to get in. My stomach churned. I looked out into the trees, but there was nothing, just empty woods stretching out in all directions. I told myself it had to be a lost hiker, maybe a drunk hunter who wandered too close. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. This place was miles from any trails, and no one just wanders out here. I considered leaving, packing up and driving back to town. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Whoever it was, they were gone now. I had an axe, a hunting knife. I'd be fine. That night, I kept the fire roaring, the flashlight by my side. I sat up in bed, listening. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, moving around the cabin. A faint creak of wood as weight pressed onto the porch. Then silence. I gripped the flashlight, sweat beading on my forehead. I wanted to rush out, to shine the light and catch whoever was out there. But I was afraid of what I might see. Minutes dragged by. Then, in the absolute stillness, a soft, deliberate tap on the window. My whole body locked up. I wanted to turn my head, to look, but I couldn't. I sat frozen, staring straight ahead, my breathing shallow. Another tap, and then nothing. The sun came up slowly. I stayed awake, waiting. When the light finally filtered through the trees, I forced myself to move. The footprints were back. They led from the trees to the porch, circling the cabin again and again. This time I saw something else. Near the window, at about chest height, was a smear of dirt, like someone had pressed their face against the glass. That was it. I packed my things in 10 minutes, threw them into the truck, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. I never told my friend what happened. I never went back. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I think about that cabin, about the footprints, about the person who was out there watching me, circling, waiting, and I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A break from everything, the noise, the stress, the constant feeling of being surrounded by people. The cabin was exactly what I wanted. Isolated, deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive there was uneventful. The last 20 miles were on a dirt road, winding through thick forest. The trees crowded in on both sides, making the road feel narrower than it was. The sun was still up when I arrived, but the shade from the trees made it feel later in the day. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft and a front porch. It looked old but solid. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a hand pump well about 30 yards out back. That was fine with me. I wanted to be alone. I unpacked my supplies, setting my food in the cooler I'd brought and stacking my firewood near the stove. The air was still and quiet, only the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind. I sat on the porch for a while, just listening. No distant traffic, no voices, no hum of electronics, just the woods. I liked that. As the sun set, I got a fire going in the stove. It wasn't cold, but I liked the warmth, the way it filled the cabin. I set up my sleeping bag in the loft and read by lantern light until I felt tired. Outside, the night was completely black. No moon, no distant lights from houses or roads, just darkness. I slept well. The next morning, I hiked a few miles, exploring the trails behind the cabin. The forest was dense, the ground soft with damp leaves. There were no signs of people, no litter, no old campfires, nothing. It felt untouched. I liked that too. That afternoon, I chopped some wood and carried water from the well. Simple tasks, but they felt good. Everything was quiet, the air thick with the smell of pine and earth. Around sunset, I was sitting on the porch again, watching the last light fade. That's when I noticed it. A sound, distant but distinct, like something moving through the trees, far off but steady. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it didn't stop. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. I listened for a while, then went inside. I locked the door. Not that it would do much, but it made me feel better. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with warmth. I tried to ignore the sound outside. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down something felt off. It was too steady, too deliberate. I forced myself to sleep, but I woke up several times, listening. The next day, I checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed. The woods were silent again. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I spent the day hiking, keeping busy. By evening, I felt normal again. But as the sun set, the sound returned. Closer this time, the same steady movement through the trees. I stood on the porch, staring into the woods. I couldn't see anything, just shadows and darkness. I stayed out there longer than I should have, listening, waiting for something to reveal itself. But nothing did. Eventually, I went inside and locked the door again. That night, I barely slept. I heard the sound several times, each time seeming closer. The last time I woke up, it was early morning. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was enough light to see. I climbed down from the loft and looked out the window. Footprints, in the dirt, just beyond the porch. Not animal tracks, human. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, then back again. I stared at them for a long time, my mind trying to make sense of it. Had someone been out here watching me? Why? How long had they been there? I stepped onto the porch, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. The woods looked the same as they always had. Still silent. But now I felt different. I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, maybe still was. I went back inside and locked the door. I had no phone service, no way to call for help. I had a hunting knife, but that didn't make me feel much better. I packed my things quickly. I didn't want to be there another night. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe some hunter had wandered too close, not realizing I was here. Maybe it was some local messing with me. But deep down, I knew better. The prints were too close, too deliberate. I loaded my gear into my truck and left. The drive out felt longer than before. The road seemed narrower, the trees pressing in. I checked my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. I didn't relax until I hit pavement again, miles from the cabin. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, pulling into a gas station to gather myself. I thought about telling someone, the gas station clerk, the police, anyone. But what would I say? That I heard footsteps and saw some prints? That wasn't a crime. I filled up my tank and kept driving. I didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. Never even considered it. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I don't want to know. I just know that something wasn't right. That place wasn't empty. Someone was watching, and they knew I was alone. The cabin was old. It had been there long before I ever set foot in that stretch of forest, tucked away deep in the woods where the trees grew thick and close, their branches so intertwined that even at midday, the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. The place belonged to my uncle, who had built it years ago, but after he passed, it was mostly left alone. Every now and then, a family member would go up to check on it, make sure it hadn't been vandalized or taken over by squatters, but otherwise it stood empty. That was why I went up there alone one fall, planning to stay a few days, get away from the noise of the city, and maybe do some hunting. The drive took hours, the last stretch a rough dirt road that wound through the trees, barely wide enough for my truck. When I finally arrived, the place looked just as I remembered. Weathered wooden walls, a tin roof streaked with rust, and a wraparound porch with a few old chairs that had seen better days. The first thing I did was check the inside. It smelled of dust and wood, the air stale from being shut up for months. I opened a few windows, letting the cool autumn air sweep through while I went about unpacking. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen with an old propane stove, and a single bedroom with a narrow cot pushed against the wall. Basic, but it was all I needed. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the stove, ate a quick meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind moved through the trees in soft, steady gusts, and every now and then, I'd hear an owl or the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, and before long, I crawled into bed and fell asleep. The next morning, I planned to hike out a bit and check for deer sign. I brought my rifle just in case, but mostly I just wanted to get a feel for the area. The sun was just coming up as I set out, the ground covered in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. The forest was quiet in that early morning way, only the occasional bird call breaking the stillness. About an hour in, I found tracks. Not deer, though, bear. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, and larger than I would have liked to see so close to the cabin. I crouched down, studying them, my stomach tightening. The claws had left deep gouges in the dirt, and the way they were spaced told me the bear was big, real big. I stood, glancing around, suddenly feeling exposed. I'd seen bears before, of course, but usually from a safe distance. Seeing fresh tracks like this was different. It meant the bear was nearby, probably not right at that moment, but close enough that I needed to be careful. I turned back toward the cabin, moving a little faster than before, keeping my rifle ready. The whole way back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark shape moving between the trees. But nothing came. Still, by the time I got back, my hands were clammy, and I was more aware than ever of how alone I was. That night, I made sure to keep my rifle within reach. I didn't like the idea of a bear wandering so close. I double-checked the cabin door, making sure the latch was secure, and set a few pots and pans near the porch, hoping they'd make noise if something heavy walked through. Then, After one last look outside, I went to bed. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound that sent a jolt of fear through my chest. A deep, heavy exhale. Not the wind, not the trees creaking. Something alive, something big. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a soft thud. Then another. Something was walking outside the cabin. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my rifle. My hands were shaking as I gripped it, my ears straining to hear every sound. The footsteps stopped for a moment. Then there was a long, slow, dragging sound against the wooden porch. I didn't dare move. The only thing between me and whatever was out there was a thin wooden door, and that didn't make me feel any safer. Another exhale. Then the creak of a board as something shifted its weight. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The bear, because I knew that's what it had to be, was right outside, probably sniffing at the door, maybe smelling the food I'd cooked earlier. I gripped the rifle tighter, debating whether I should try to scare it off or stay quiet and hope it left on its own. Then, with a sudden crash, the pots and pans I'd set out went flying. The bear must have knocked into them, startled by the noise. I heard a sharp huff, then the heavy sound of it moving away. The footsteps faded into the distance, and then silence. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. I didn't move until I was sure the bear was gone. Even then, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I found deep claw marks on the porch, long gouges in the wood where the bear had raked its claws. The pots and pans were scattered, one of them flattened like a piece of scrap metal. The tracks led away from the cabin, back into the trees. I followed them a little way, just enough to see that the bear had moved on. That was enough for me. I packed up my things, loaded my truck, and left. I'd come out here for peace, for quiet, for time alone. But after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something massive lurking just beyond the trees. The bear had moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been, how thin that door was, how easily things could have gone differently. I never went back to that cabin. Let someone else check on it. I was done.